There's a pattern in the history of American technology that nobody teaches in business school, and Professor Jiang is one of the few people who has described it in public without being immediately dismissed. The pattern is not complicated. A government institution, a defense contractor, or a federally funded research program develops a technology, then walks away from it, hands it to a civilian with a good story, and watches the civilian become a billionaire while the institution retains every form of access it actually needs. Jiang calls this the frontman model, and in the Jack Neal episode, he applies it to Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, Sam Altman, and Satoshi Nakamoto in the same breath. But the most verifiable version of the argument, the one with a paper trail anyone can follow, begins not with Jobs, but with the man Jobs needed, Steve Wozniak, employee number 12,400 at Hewlett-Packard, designer of scientific calculators, and the actual engineer who built the machine that became the Apple I. In 1975, Steve Wozniak was working at Hewlett-Packard during the day and building a personal computer in his spare time, often in his HP cubicle after hours, using skills, tools, and an engineering environment that HP had provided him. Under standard employment contract law of the era, anything an employee creates using employer resources and expertise can constitute employer intellectual property. And Wozniak himself acknowledged this, which is exactly why he did what he did next. He offered the Apple I to Hewlett-Packard. Not once. 5 times by his own account, confirmed in multiple interviews including his address to Georgia State University students, and documented by Apple, Insider, Britannica, and Inca magazine. He begged them to take it, in his own word, because he felt he owed it to HP and because he genuinely loved the company. 5 times, HP said no, a decision that HP co-founder Bill Hewlett reportedly acknowledged later with the words, "You win some, you lose some." This is the version of the story that gets taught. HP was short-sighted, Wozniak was a genius who escaped the corporate system, and Apple became the most valuable company in human history, almost by accident. But Jiang's framework asks a different question, and it is a legitimate one. Why would a defense contractor with significant military computing contracts, HP was not just a calculator company, it was a supplier to the United States government and NASA, voluntarily waive its legal claim to the foundational hardware of the personal computer revolution? The bear case for Jiang's argument here is straightforward and important. The simpler explanation is that HP was organized around enterprise and scientific instruments, not consumer products, and the personal computer market looked tiny and speculative in 1975. Several HP executives interviewed later said they simply could not see the commercial potential. That is a fully coherent account of what happened, and it does not require any coordination between HP's leadership and any government institution. But Jiang's framework does not need coordination to be structurally accurate. What it needs is a pattern, and the pattern continues with precision. Steve Wozniak designed the hardware. Steve Jobs designed the narrative. Wozniak was the engineer who had no desire for public life. He returned to college under a pseudonym after a plane crash in 1981, and he remained a background figure while Jobs became the face of the revolution. Jobs was the frontman by Jiang's definition, the charismatic civilian who absorbed the public's attention while the technical infrastructure was built by someone else in a different environment with different resources. Now apply the same framework to Google. Larry Page and Sergey Brin developed their search algorithm at Stanford University, a research institution that receives billions of dollars in federal funding and has maintained a documented relationship with the American intelligence community since the Cold War era. Responsible Statecraft confirmed that the initial development of their research received funding from a United States intelligence community-launched program called Massive Digital Data Systems, which was designed to develop tools for processing and analyzing large volumes of digital information. Page and Brin were graduate students when they built the thing that became the most powerful information retrieval system ever created. Then they became the public faces of a company worth more than $2 trillion. Then comes Siri. In 2003, DARPA funded a research project at SRI International, the Stanford Research Institute, called CALO, an acronym for Cognitive Assistant that Learns and Organizes. The CALO project received over $200 million in federal funding and involved over 300 researchers across 25 universities. From this project, a spin-off company called Siri Inc. was created, which built a commercial voice assistant application. Apple acquired Siri Inc. in 2010 for an undisclosed sum, and Steve Jobs unveiled Siri as part of the iPhone 4S in 2011 as if it were an Apple invention. The DARPA origin is documented, verifiable, and almost never mentioned in the standard history of the iPhone. The pattern across these 3 cases is the same in structural terms. Government or quasi-government funding develops a core capability. An institutional decision is made, whether deliberately or by bureaucratic indifference, to allow that capability to move into the private sector. A civilian face is attached to it. The civilian becomes wealthy and famous. The institution retains access to the infrastructure as a customer, as a regulator, as a contractor, or through the legal framework that governs the technology's operation. And most importantly, the public narrative focuses entirely on the genius of the individual rather than the institutional foundations of what they built. Jiang uses this pattern to argue that Satoshi Nakamoto fits the same template perfectly. An anonymous individual or group with no verified identity, using a pseudonym that disappears at the moment the system is established, creates a technology that requires precisely the kind of cryptographic expertise that was, at that moment, concentrated in exactly 3 places on Earth: the NSA, DARPA, and the academic departments those institutions funded. Then Satoshi disappears with the same completeness as a classified program being moved off public-facing documentation, and leaves behind 1.1 million Bitcoin that have never moved, in a wallet that could belong to anyone or no one. The bear case remains valid. Thousands of real engineers and cryptographers in the 1990s and 2000s were working on digital cash without any government connection, and the homebrew tradition of open source development that produced Wozniak's Apple. I was genuinely civilian in character. Adam Back published Hashcash in 1997. Wei Dai described B-Money in 1998. Nick Szabo designed BitGold in the same period. All 3 are plausible Satoshi candidates with documented civilian cryptography backgrounds and no known intelligence connections. The Frontman architecture is a pattern, not a proof. What the pattern does, Demo-Hussein and what Jiang is most right about, is make the conventional narrative feel insufficient. A lone genius built a revolutionary financial system and gave it away for free is not a story that fits any other moment in the history of technology. It has never happened before. It has not happened since. And the one time it allegedly happened, the lone genius turned out to have no verifiable identity at all. During the Jack Neal episode, Jiang Sui-Chin opens his Bitcoin argument with a specific linguistic claim. He says, and this is a direct quote from the transcript, "They say that it translates into central intelligence." He is talking about the name Satoshi Nakamoto. And this is the moment where the channel's obligation to factual precision becomes most important, because Jiang is summarizing a theory that exists online, not making a verified linguistic argument, and the distinction matters more than it might appear. Here is what the name actually means. Satoshi, written in the most common kanji, Kong, means quick-witted, wise, or clear-thinking. It is a standard Japanese masculine given name with no technical or institutional connotation. Naka, Zhong, means middle or central, and Moto, Nyaos, Ben, means origin, foundation, or root. The surname Nakamoto combined therefore means roughly central origin, or one of central foundation. It is a common Japanese surname, concentrated historically in the Ryukyu Islands, according to linguistic documentation confirmed by BitGet's wiki entry and multiple Japanese language analysis sources. The theory that Satoshi Nakamoto translates to central intelligence requires 2 separate moves. First, you interpret Satoshi not as its ordinary meaning of wise, but as a reference to intelligence in its institutional sense, which is not a standard interpretation of the character. Second, you interpret Naka as central in the sense of centralized agency, rather than its geographic and topographical meaning of middle place. This is not a translation. It is a rereading of ordinary words through a conspiratorial frame. In Japanese, central intelligence, as an institutional concept, is rendered as Chuo-Joho, Zhongyang Qingbao, which has no phonetic resemblance to Satoshi Nakamoto. This was confirmed in a publicly available Hacker News linguistic analysis thread from September 2024 that included contributions from native Japanese speakers. Why does this matter? Because it is the first piece of evidence Jiang offers in the interview, and it is the weakest. If the name argument crumbles under 2 minutes of linguistic examination, a viewer who does that examination immediately discredits everything that follows, including the genuinely strong structural arguments about NSA cryptography, chainalysis, and the paradox of a surveillance-friendly ledger presented as a privacy tool. The name theory is not Jiang's argument. It is internet mythology that Jiang absorbed and repeated, and he signals this himself when he says "they say," rather than making it a direct claim. He is reporting a theory, not asserting a fact. But here is where the linguistic analysis leads to something more interesting than a simple correction. The real significance of the name is not what it means, but what it does not tell us. The pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto is written in the Latin alphabet in every known Satoshi communication, not in kanji, not in any Japanese script. This is documented in every archived email and forum post attributed to Satoshi. For a native Japanese speaker creating a genuine pseudonym, the default would be kanji. The consistent use of the Latin alphabet version has been noted by multiple researchers as a possible indication that the name was chosen by someone unfamiliar with Japanese naming conventions. meaning a non-Japanese person or organization choosing a name that sounds Japanese without having a native relationship to the language. This does not prove anything. Non-Japanese cryptographers who had read extensively about Japanese culture might reasonably choose a Japanese-sounding name in Romanized form as a pseudonym with no deeper significance. Hal Finney, Adam Back, and Nick Szabo all worked in international communities where cultural references were fluid. The Romanized pseudonym could reflect nothing more than the international digital communication environment of 2008, where Latin script was the universal technical default. The bear case for any name-based argument is the same in all directions. Names do not prove identities, and interpretations of names prove even less. The entire category of the name reveals the creator analysis. Whether it points toward the CIA, toward Nick Szabo, toward the NSA, or toward any specific individual, rests on a logical error that linguists call the etymological fallacy, the assumption that the original or hidden meaning of a word determines its actual use. Parents give children names without expecting those names to predict destinies. Pseudonym authors choose names for rhythm, for cultural connotation, or for randomness. The absence of a kanji form for Satoshi Nakamoto is genuinely interesting. The Central Intelligence translation is not. What Jiang's name argument actually reveals, and this is more valuable than the argument itself, is how the human pattern recognition system works when applied to a genuine mystery. The brain fills voids with structure. When a creator is anonymous and a creation is revolutionary, the mind reverse engineers an origin story from whatever fragments are available, including phonetic resemblances, etymological stretches, and numerical coincidences. The NSA's SHA-256 connection is a real technical fact with documented provenance. The Okamoto phonetic resemblance is a pattern that exists in sound only, not in meaning. The Central Intelligence name translation is a forced rereading of ordinary words. Jiang, to his credit, signals the difference by attributing the claim to others rather than asserting it himself. But most viewers, and most articles that covered the clip, did not notice that qualification. The analytical discipline the channel is built on requires separating these three tiers: verified technical connections with documented provenance, phonetic and etymological patterns that are interesting but not probative, and outright misreadings that collapse under basic verification. Jiang's strongest arguments live in the first tier. The name argument lives in the third. The channel's job is to use his map to reach a destination he did not navigate to, which means using the verified material and setting aside the linguistic mythology without losing the viewer who came for the Jiang content in the first place. That is, the editorial tightrope this video is walking every single minute. In the Jack Neal episode, at approximately the 42-minute and 40-second mark, Jiang Suiqin says something that the clip editors cut away from almost immediately. And it is the most technically devastating question in the entire interview. Where are the blockchain servers located? Because I imagine if you're able to control the hardware, you can also control the software. I don't care what they tell me about open source and all that. I want to know where the databases are, where the servers are physically. Almost nobody followed up on this. Yahoo Finance covered Jiang's CIA claim. The Street covered it. CCN covered it. Not one of those articles answered the hardware question. This channel is going to answer it, because the answer is more unsettling than any name translation or phonetic coincidence. Bitcoin does not have servers in the conventional sense of the word. The network is distributed across thousands of nodes globally, and any single node can theoretically be run by anyone with sufficient computing power and internet access. That is the foundational architectural claim. That is what the white paper describes, and it is accurate as a description of the protocol. What it does not describe, and what the actual data reveals in a way Satoshi's 9-page document never anticipated, is what happens to a distributed network when industrial economics take over from ideological volunteerism. Bitcoin mining is the process by which new transactions are verified and added to the blockchain. It requires computational power, increasingly enormous amounts of it, to solve the cryptographic puzzles that secure each block. In the early years of Bitcoin, this could be done on a personal computer. By 2013, it required dedicated hardware. By 2017, it required industrial-scale operations. By 2025, it required access to cheap electricity in large quantities, specialized ASIC chips that cost thousands of dollars each, and facilities with sophisticated cooling infrastructure. This economic reality did not expand the mining base. It concentrated it. Here is what the current data shows, verified against hashrate index, mempool.space, BNCrypto, and CryptoSlate, as of early 2026. Foundry USA, which is a subsidiary of Digital Currency Group, the parent company of Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, controls approximately 30% of the global Bitcoin hash rate. AntPool, which is operated by Bitmain Technologies, headquartered in Beijing, controls approximately 17 to 19%. Together, those two pools control close to 50% of all computational power securing the Bitcoin network at any given time. adding via BTC at roughly 14%, F2Pool at approximately 10%, and Macroeconomics at approximately 5%. The 5 largest mining pools collectively control somewhere between 75 and 80% of the global hash rate. The bear case for the significance of this number requires careful attention. A mining pool is not a mining operation. Foundry USA does not own the mining hardware of all the individual miners who contribute their computing power to its pool. It is an organizational layer that aggregates computing resources from thousands of independent miners, distributes block finding rewards according to contributed hash power, and takes a fee for the service. Individual miners can leave Foundry and join AntPool or Macroeconomics or any other pool whenever they choose. The concentration at the pool level does not mean a single entity physically controls 75% of the network servers. It means a single entity coordinates the activity of machines that collectively represent that share. But this distinction, while important in theory, has been challenged in practice on multiple occasions that are on the public record. In July 2024, CryptoSlate documented that AntPool had mined 5 out of 6 consecutive blocks. Blocks 850,448 through 850,453 in rapid succession. In January 2025, Foundry USA mined 7 consecutive blocks in approximately 70 minutes. Mining pools that can mine consecutive blocks with that frequency have, for those periods, functional control over what gets recorded on the blockchain and in what order. This is not a theoretical 51% attack. It is the normal operation of the concentrated network. The geopolitical dimension of the concentration map is the layer Jiang was intuiting when he asked about server locations. And the reality is more complicated, not less alarming, than a simple "the CIA controls the hardware" claim. Foundry USA is American-owned and operates under American regulatory jurisdiction. It processes KYC, Know Your Customer, requirements for institutional miners, meaning its operator has a detailed record of every large-scale mining participant using its infrastructure. AntPool is Chinese-owned through Bitmain, which is headquartered in Beijing and subject to Chinese law, including requirements that Chinese companies must cooperate with state security services when requested. In 2024, Bitmain reportedly sold 32 exahashes per second of American-generated hash rate to a Chinese-affiliated entity, as documented by Brave Newcoin, further blurring the already contested jurisdictional boundaries. What Jiang was pointing to when he asked about server locations was the gap between the protocol and the infrastructure. The protocol is open source and decentralized, verifiable by anyone with the relevant expertise. The infrastructure, the physical machines doing the work of securing the ledger, is concentrated in facilities operated by a handful of corporate entities, under the jurisdictional authority of the 2 countries most engaged in strategic economic competition on the planet. The United States government, through its regulatory relationship with Foundry USA's parent company, and through its oversight of publicly traded mining firms like Marathon Digital and Riot Platforms, has meaningful insight into a substantial fraction of Bitcoin's computational backbone. Here's the specific technical point that closes the loop on Jiang's question. The blockchain is secured by the miners. The miners are concentrated in the pools. The pools are concentrated in 2 corporate entities with documented relationships to 2 state apparatuses. Whether or not the CIA created Bitcoin in 2008, the American state has, through normal market dynamics, regulatory capture, and the economics of industrial mining, achieved precisely the kind of infrastructural proximity to the network that Jiang's game theory predicts a state actor would want. It did not need to create Bitcoin to end up here. It needed only to wait while market concentration did the work for it. Jiang's second answer to the question of why the CIA would create Bitcoin is financing. He says it clearly in the interview. The CIA uses Bitcoin for black operations because it needs a mechanism to finance operations outside of political control, and specifically mentions drug trafficking. This is the part of his argument that most journalists dismissed as conspiracy theory without engaging the underlying question, which is historically serious. How did American intelligence agencies finance covert operations outside congressional oversight before Bitcoin? And does the blockchain actually solve the problem they had? The answer to the first part of that question is not speculation. It is documented congressional history. The Church Committee, formerly the United States Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with respect to intelligence activities, convened in January 1975 after Seymour Hersh published a front-page New York Times story revealing that the CIA had conducted a massive illegal domestic surveillance program against anti-war protesters and American dissidents. The committee's investigation, which included over 800 witnesses, more than 110,000 documents, and 126 full committee meetings, produced the most comprehensive audit of American intelligence financing in the country's history. What the Church Committee found regarding money was specific and disturbing. The committee documented, as recorded in its final reports and confirmed in the Harvard Law School briefing papers on federal budget policy, that a large proportion of funds spent for CIA covert action projects had come from Defense Department advances. More than half of large-scale covert action programs between 1961 and 1976 had never come to the Office of Management and Budget for review. The CIA maintained funding mechanisms that were deliberately structured to avoid the appropriations process that the Constitution assigns to Congress. Senator Frank Church himself said, in testimony that was recorded and is publicly available, that the agency had operated with insufficient oversight and that its secret funding mechanisms represented a fundamental challenge to democratic accountability. This was not a peripheral finding. The Church Committee established that the American intelligence apparatus had, for at least 3 decades, operated a parallel financial system hidden within Defense Department appropriations, accessible to the Director of Central Intelligence without congressional review. Programs like MK-Ultra, the CIA's human experimentation project involving unwitting American citizens, were financed through these mechanisms. So was Operation Chaos, the domestic surveillance program. So were assassination plots against foreign leaders, including Fidel Castro, Patrice Lumumba, and Rafael Trujillo, all documented in the committee's interim report. After the Church Committee, Congress created the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and enacted the Hughes-Ryan Amendment, requiring the president to find and report covert operations to Congress. Intelligence agencies adapted. The Iran-Contra affair of the 1980s revealed that these adaptations were incomplete. Oliver North, working from the National Security Council, had created a private financing network funded in part through illegal arms sales to Iran and profits funneled to Nicaraguan rebels, bypassing both congressional oversight and CIA accountability structures. The mechanism was different. The problem, how to finance operations outside visible accounting, was identical to the one the Church Committee had identified a decade earlier. Now apply Jiang's framework to Bitcoin. The question is not whether the CIA created Bitcoin for this purpose. The question Jiang is actually asking, and it is a legitimate analytical question, is whether Bitcoin would be a better black budget mechanism than the Defense Department advance system the Church Committee exposed, and whether a state actor with this historical problem would recognize that utility. The answer is complicated. An honest analysis requires presenting the complication. Bitcoin is a worse black budget tool than cash for one specific reason. Every transaction is permanently recorded on a public ledger. If the CIA wanted to finance a covert operation in a way that could never be traced, cash in a bag delivered by a contractor would provide better operational security than a Bitcoin transaction that, even through multiple mixing operations, leaves a permanent on-chain footprint that organizations like Chainalysis are paid $10 million per year by the federal government to analyze. The Silk Road case proved this in 2013. Ross Ulbricht ran a billion-dollar dark web market using Bitcoin and was caught through blockchain analysis. Drug traffickers who used Bitcoin as their primary financial tool went to prison precisely because the ledger was transparent. But here is where Jiang's intuition about surveillance, as opposed to operational secrecy, becomes more defensible. Bitcoin is a poor tool for financing secret operations. It is an excellent tool for monitoring who is financing secret operations that you did not create. The distinction matters. An intelligence agency that controls Chainalysis's analytical infrastructure, that has subpoenas available against American regulated exchanges, and that has legal access to KYC records at Foundry USA, does not need to have created Bitcoin to benefit from a world in which every financial dissident, every sanctions evader, every gray market operator, and every political opposition movement in an authoritarian country tries to use Bitcoin to avoid surveillance. They have all obligingly placed their financial history on a permanent public ledger that the American surveillance infrastructure reads continuously. Former CIA Acting Director Michael Morell made exactly this argument in his April 2021 report, published by the Crypto Council for Innovation, confirmed by Decrypt. He called Bitcoin's blockchain a government surveillance tool, not metaphorically, but as a direct operational assessment. He said it was a powerful but underutilized forensic tool for governments to identify illicit activity and bring criminals to justice. The person who ran the CIA said in public that the asset marketed as financial privacy is one of the most effective financial surveillance tools in existence. The Church Committee established that the agency had maintained off-budget financing for decades without congressional approval. Jiang's argument is that these two facts belong in the same sentence. The channel is not saying he is right. The channel is saying that nobody who covered the clip asked why a former CIA director would describe his surveillance capabilities using a currency that was supposed to replace the institutions he spent his career building. Jack Neal noticed it in the interview, and Jiang confirmed it in 3 words. It's designed like a religion. The exchange lasted less than 15 seconds before the conversation moved on. The channel is not moving on. because the structural analysis of Bitcoin as a religious system is not a metaphor, and it is not an insult. It is a documented observation that has been published in peer-reviewed academic literature, and it tells you something specific about the engineering decisions behind the asset's design that rational financial analysis completely misses. In February 2026, the journal Socioeconomic Review, published by Oxford Academic, released a peer-reviewed paper by a sociologist at the University of California, Berkeley, titled "Fix the Money, Fix the World: Bitcoin as Techno-Libertarian Religion." The paper is based on direct ethnographic observation at Bitcoin meetups, the 2023 Bitcoin conference, and digital ethnography across X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. The researchers' conclusion is not that Bitcoin believers are irrational or cult-like in a dismissive sense. The conclusion is Durkheimian. Bitcoin has functionally constructed the same structural elements that Emil Durkheim, the founder of modern sociology of religion, identified as constitutive of religious experience: shared beliefs about the nature of reality, ritual practices that recommit members to those beliefs, and a moral community that sanctions and expels those who deviate from orthodoxy. Start with the scripture. On January 3rd, 2009, an anonymous author embedded a newspaper headline inside the first Bitcoin block ever created, a technical act that required deliberate choice, since the Genesis block could have contained anything or nothing at all. The Times, 03 John 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks, is a political statement, a timestamp, and a philosophical declaration simultaneously. It is a founding text. It functions in Bitcoin communities the way a sacred inscription functions in religious traditions, as evidence that the founding act was not accidental but purposive, that the creator understood the significance of what was being built, and that the community's beliefs are rooted in historical reality rather than mythology. The fact that the author is anonymous makes the founding text more powerful, not less, consistent with the pattern of foundational religious documents whose human authorship is unknown or disputed. Then comes the prophet. Satoshi Nakamoto published the white paper, created the Genesis block, mined the first Bitcoin, corresponded with early community members for 2 years, and then vanished. In April 2011, Satoshi sent a final email to developer Mike Hearn that read, "I've moved on to other things." Since then, absolute silence. Despite the fact that Satoshi's wallets contain 1.1 million Bitcoin worth approximately $82 billion at April 2026 prices. And moving those coins would immediately be detected and covered by every financial publication on Earth. The sociological function of this disappearance is not incidental to Bitcoin's cultural structure. It is constitutive of it. A prophet who remains present is a human being subject to error, contradiction, and revision. A prophet who disappears at the moment of founding becomes something structurally different. An authority whose original texts are complete, whose later opinions cannot modify the canon, and whose absence creates a permanent interpretive community, arguing over what the founder really meant. Now consider the halving, the event that Bloomberg's executive editor of news, Joe Weisenthal, described to NPR as like a harvest festival, except it only takes place every 4 years. The halving is a programmed event in Bitcoin's code that cuts the reward for mining a new block exactly in half every 210,000 blocks, approximately every 4 years. The first halving was in 2012, the second in 2016, the third in 2020, the fourth in April 2024. The halving has no macroeconomic rationale that would be accepted in standard monetary theory. Central banks do not cut the money supply on a fixed timer regardless of economic conditions. Its function is to create programmatic scarcity, but its effect in Bitcoin communities is ritual. Halvings are celebrated with global events, conference speeches, countdown clocks, and community memorialization. Joseph Laycock, assistant professor of religious studies at Texas State University, writing in The Conversation, identified the halving explicitly as a ritual practice in the religious studies sense, an action that has functional effects on the community, performing it independent of its technical effects on the network. The broader ritual inventory of Bitcoin includes behaviors that academic researchers have now documented extensively. Hodling, holding Bitcoin regardless of market conditions, is identified in the 2026 Oxford academic paper as a ritual practice of faith against the temptation to sell, structurally analogous to religious practices of ascetic self-denial. Stacking sats, buying small, regular amounts of Bitcoin regardless of price, is what religion scholar Harley McCook explicitly identified as tithing, the practice of regular donations to a religious institution, in an analysis published in the Next Web in 2022. Bitcoin Pizza Day, the annual commemoration of the first commercial Bitcoin transaction on May 22, 2010, functions as a recognized calendar event in the community with the same sociological purpose as religious holidays. the sanctification of time, the creation of shared memory, and the reinforcement of collective identity. The heretic expulsion mechanism is also documented. The Bitcoin community maintains an internal boundary between Bitcoin maximalists, those who hold that Bitcoin is the only legitimate cryptocurrency, and holders of other assets, who are subject to explicit social sanction in community spaces. The American Academy of Religion hosted a 2023 panel titled Bitcoin is Freedom, Rituals in Bitcoin Maximalism, that identified dollar-cost averaging, hodling, and stacking sats as the three core ritual practices that sustain maximalists in spite of the volatility of crypto markets, which is precisely the function of ritual in sociological terms. Behavior that maintains commitment to a belief system when empirical evidence would otherwise destabilize it. Now ask the question Jiang did not ask. If someone were designing an asset for maximum adoption and minimum defection, would they design it to have religious structural features? The answer, from the history of technology adoption, is almost certainly yes. Religious communities have the highest behavioral compliance rates and the lowest defection rates of any human social organization. Members of religious communities tithe, give money to institutions without expectation of direct return, at rates that would be irrational under standard economic models. They hold beliefs in the face of contradicting evidence. They recruit family members and friends with evangelical intensity. They treat community membership as identity rather than preference. The bear case is direct. Religious structural features can emerge organically from any community built around shared values and a contested new idea. Open source software communities, political movements, and sports fandoms all develop quasi-religious practices without any design intent. The cypherpunk movement that preceded Bitcoin, with its explicit ideological commitments to privacy, cryptography, and resistance to state financial control, was a natural incubator for ritual behavior around a currency that embodied those values. You do not need a designer to explain Bitcoin's religious structure. Passionate communities build their own liturgy, but Jiang's observation, and the academic literature supports it, is that the design elements of Bitcoin are unusually well optimized for producing religious adherence in ways that appear intentional rather than emergent. The anonymous founder who disappears rather than remaining to revise and update, the fixed canonical text, the programmatic ritual events encoded in the protocol itself, the scarcity model that creates competition for a finite resource, which is the exact mechanism that theological economists from David Graeber to Deirdre McCloskey have identified as a driver of sacred value attribution. These are not accidental features of a system built by a lone cypherpunk who just wanted to solve the double spending problem. They are precisely the features that a designer would include if they wanted the system to generate maximum cultural adoption, minimum rational defection, and a community that would defend the asset with the intensity of religious conviction. Whether or not Satoshi was a government project, the asset has a religious architecture that makes it extremely difficult to replace with a superior technology, extremely resistant to coordination on hard forks that would threaten incumbents, and extremely likely to persist across regulatory hostility, market crashes, and geopolitical disruption. For an institution seeking a durable financial surveillance infrastructure with genuinely global adoption, this is not an accident. It is the ideal feature set. And as the former acting director of the CIA told the world in 2021, the ledger is transparent, the blockchain is a forensic tool, and the money that was built to resist governments has become the most government-readable financial system in human history.